Jung and Tolkien each ventured into a world revealed by vision, or imagination, or fantasy. And each man employed all of those terms to describe what had happened to them. There, however one defines the visionary there, they met a reality, an independent, autonomous, objective fact. They both felt they had discovered something precious, something vital, alive, something of signal importance, something they needed to share with the people of their time. And each man kept private accounts of his experiences, records of what he had seen and heard in his interactions with the imaginal. Both men labored for decades with meticulously crafted primary manuscript accounts of this experience. And strangely enough, as we've heard, both men ended up calling the records of what they brought back from their explorations of the imaginal their Red Book. During life, neither man finished or published his full record, his full account. Dr. Jung and Professor Tolkien recognized that their experiences were far from ordinary. What had happened to them was so strange, so rare, so non-ordinary, that they struggled throughout their lives to find a way of explaining it. What words could one use to explain the reality of an imaginal world opened by vision? They toiled trying to find a way of revealing, or at least interpreting, their observations to others. They both searched the annals of history for accounts of similar events, paradigms that might indicate similar experience. And by the end of their lives, neither man felt he had succeeded in his efforts to have his experience understood. Nonetheless, both Tolkien and Jung affirmed in unequivocal statements that what they had discovered was indeed a living fact, a substrata of consciousness, or an inherent natural function of consciousness, a province of experience intimately involved in life and in the story we call human history. It was, they both declared, the spring of a creative power that moved and transformed history. How does one understand such experiences, such affirmations, such human lives? How did they understand themselves? How will we interpret them? How do we interpret a vision? Something which is apparently seen other than by ordinary sight. Do we simply deny it any relevance to life? Call it meaningless? Declare it a sensory aberration? Are things seen within with the second sight, in vision, merely phantom shadows of outward reality? Do we pathologize this experience if we allow it happens? Do we call it an illness of the mind or the brain? A disorder of perception of reality mediated by some natural and recurrent aberrancy of neural tissue. And here I say natural and recurrent because it does appear to be a fact of human nature. And over millennia, it does seem to be recurrent. Well, look, as a doctor, I know about the pathology of hallucination. And I should also add, when these events happen, people often relate them in religious or spiritual traditional formats. Because where else do you have a language, a hermeneutics, for this event? Okay, this other word, this strange word, hermeneutics. How does one interpret vision? Hermeneutics is the art of interpretation, the art of moving meaning between domains of expression and understanding. Historically, the term was often linked with the Greek god Hermes, who was the one who brought messages from gods to men, the one who went betwixt realms, worlds, realities, communicating, translating. It is the art of Hermes. In Western tradition, the hermeneutic art originally centered on the interpretation of sacred writ, on how one should interpret prophetic, visionary, biblical texts. Were these texts to be read as accurate and precise histories of real events, perhaps histories with a moral? Or were they to be read allegorically? Or was there something else hidden in them, some other intention in these supposed sacred and mythic accounts? And then much later, from the early 19th century onward, hermeneutics moved into wider spheres, into methods and the philosophical difficulties of interpreting any text, any creative human act, human work. Tolkien and Jung, in their academic writings published during their lives, both concerned themselves with the hermeneutic art. They both applied their professional approaches to ancient texts and myths. And a couple of times Jung even referred to what he was doing as his hermeneutic method. His psychology was a hermeneutics. But in private, each struggled with interpretive matters at a much more intimate level, an immediate level. Their task began not with an interpretation of a text, their principal life task, but with the interpretation of visionary, imaginative events. How did one interpret oneself? The one who met and mediated two realities. What was it to live a life with such a commission, such a burden? And both men independently struggled with that as well. It was a tough gig. Writing in 1950, when Jung was 75 years old, he explained his situation 40 years earlier, at the threshold of the visionary experience that produced his Red Book. The book he inscribed on its spine with the title, Liber Novus, the new book. And I quote, "The psyche is not of today. Its ancestry goes back many millions of years. Individual consciousness is only the flower and the fruit of a season, sprung from the perennial rhizome beneath the earth. And it would find itself in better accord with the truth if it took the existence of the rhizome into its calculations. For the root matter is the mother of all things." He recounted, looking back to what had happened to him on the threshold of this visionary event, he recounted that his intense study of mythologies, which had taken place in 1909, 1910, 1911, when he was about 35 years old, forced him to conclude that without a myth, a human is, quote, "like one uprooted, having no true link either with the past or with the ancestral life which continues within him, or yet with contemporary society." He continued on, "So, I suspected that myth had a meaning, which I was sure to miss if I lived outside it in the haze of my own speculations. I was driven to ask myself in all seriousness, what is the myth you are living?" I found no answer to this question, and had to admit that I was not living with a myth, or even in a myth. So in the most natural way, I took it upon myself to get to know my myth, and I regarded this as the task of tasks. I simply had to know what unconscious or preconscious myth was forming me, from what rhizome, what root I sprang. Beginning in the fall of 1913, when he was about 38 years old, and continuing over the next several years, he confronted this portentous task of tasks. He later described it as a voyage of discovery to the other pole of the world. Or in other words, the place where the mirror image begins. And he found his myth. He found his rhizome, the root from which he sprang. And more. Was he ill? I mean, did he need, drugs to fix his illness? Maybe he was threatened with a psychosis. He had had visions. He went searching through all of his own story, trying to remember dreams, trying to figure out how he could understand this, maybe even abort what might be a psychotic event. Finally, he knew he just had to give in. He just had to see what it was that was petitioning him. And so on the night of the 12th of November of 1913, he sat at his desk, he reached in to the drawer, he pulled out a journal that he had not written in for 11 years, and he addressed his soul. It's one of the most heart-rending verses I've read. And it starts, my soul, where are you? It goes on. He was petitioning some contact. And then he determined that he had to just wait and see if he could get a response back. Could he, in awakeness, remove himself enough from his concentration on the outer realm that this inner thing could show itself? Finally, he got to a point, and it opened up. He saw a passage. He thought it was an entry to an old mine. He walked through the passage. There was a withered dwarf. There was a cave. He went into the cave. He heard screeching voices. There was muck on the ground. He walked across the cave. He saw a gem of light. He picked up the gem. He looked in, and through the gem was covering an orifice, a hole. He looked in, and there was this river. And in the river floated by the body of a dead hero, followed by a scarab, followed by a sun deep in the water. And then he saw snakes, thousands and thousands of black snakes come down the walls, surround the sun, and then blood came surging up from the hole. And that was the end of the vision. He told the seminar in 1925 that he discovered that his technique worked amazingly well, but he didn't have the foggiest idea what it meant. That was the beginning of this visionary event. About 12 days later, right around Christmas, I think it was the 22nd or 23rd of December, he entered into another vision. This one was different. This one was not so evoked. It just opened. And I'll read just a little bit here. This is 22 December 1913. And this is what he told the seminar in 25. The next thing that happened to me was another fantastic vision. But this time I went much deeper. This time it was a cosmic depth. It was like going to the moon, or like the feeling of descent into empty space. In his Red Book, in Liber Novus, he recounts the vision. Here I quote from the Red Book. I lay, and this is his account. This is a primary hermeneutic, right? This is his recension of what he saw, what happened to him, as he wrote it. I lay in a dark depth. An old man stood before me. He looked like one of the old prophets. A black serpent lay at his feet. Some distance away I saw a house with columns. A beautiful maiden stepped out of the door. She walks uncertainly, and I see that she is blind. The old man waves to me. I follow him to the house at the front of a sheer rock wall. The serpent creeps behind. Suddenly a door opens on the right, onto a garden full of bright sunshine. We step outside, and the old man says to me, "Do you know where you are?" Jung replies, I am a stranger here, and everything seems strange to me, anxious, as in a dream. Who are you? And the man answers, I am Elijah, and this is my daughter, Salome. It goes on. It goes on. And it went on actually night after night for 3 nights. Jung called this his mystery play, his mysterium. At the conclusion of the first night's vision, Jung exclaims to Salome and Elijah, quote, "You are the symbols of the most extreme contradiction." Elijah responds, "We are real. We are not symbols." Several years later, Jung penned a psychological reflection on this stuff. 10 years later, private, once again unpublished, trying to talk about who these figures were. And he said they're certainly not intended allegories. They have not been consciously contrived to depict experience in either veiled or fantastic terms. Rather, they appeared as visions. He called it his mystery play. Later on, Tolkien described this sort of experience as entering a fairy, entering a Fairy drama. And we'll get to that quote in a little while. Just remember that. Entering a Fairy drama, the mystery play. For the next 2 months, Jung voluntarily entered into these depths almost nightly. And I should here step back and say, at the same time, the man was continuing his medical practice. He was seeing on average 5 patients a day during this period. He was lecturing. He was teaching. He was not psychotic. He was continuing a normal life. He was serving in the Swiss Army during subsequent periods quite, frequently. In his commentary on this material, which he wrote, this is the primary hermeneutic. Then he started doing the interpretation of what this had happened. And 9 months later, he started trying to figure this out. And this is what he said, trying to explain what had happened. He said, "If you remain within the arbitrary and artificially created boundaries, you will walk as between 2 high walls. You do not see the immensity of the world. But if you break down the walls that confine your view, then the ancient sleeper awakens in you. If you look outside yourself, you see the far-off forest and mountains, and above them your vision climbs to the realms of the stars. And if you look into yourselves, you will see, on the other hand, the nearby as far off and infinite, since the world of the inner is as infinite as the world of the outer. Man lives in 2 worlds." And during all this period, he was also doing something else. He was looking for those who might have shared a similar experience. Paradigmatic cases. Anything to indicate that what he had quite clearly experienced, this visionary realm, was a human experience, and that there were records that he could use to relate what had happened to him. By the early 1920s, he wrote this book to others. He thought he would publish it. It was only by the early 1920s he realized it was absolutely impossible. There were people around him who thought he should publish it, and he saw it was impossible, that no one would understand this. No one could understand what had happened to him. He had to develop a way of approaching such events in history. In his history, in human history. He thought it was vital to do so. And he spent the rest of his life working on that hermeneutics, that interpretive act of bringing people into an understanding of such events in history. Looking for the paradigmatic cases, and he laid out a number of them. He was a historian, a physician who was an historian looking for the history of this experience. And if you read his collected writings, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, the Meditations of Ignatius of Loyola, Meister Eckhart. These are all the texts. Kundalini. These were the things he was studying and looking at, trying to understand what had happened to him. And at the very beginning of his looking, he thought he had found an analog of his experience in the ancient writings of the Gnostics, heretics, so-called, visionaries, creating new myths at the beginning of the Christian age. Jung had seen in his visions not only the coming of a war, but the coming to an end of an age. He felt that we had actually lost our myths. That a new myth of consciousness, a new myth of what it was to be human, maybe what might be called a new type of God story, was about to begin taking formation. He saw that in human consciousness there had been major ages. He called them ions, periods of thousands of years, reaching back 6,000 years. The Christian age, the third age, was coming to an end. We were at a time of catastrophic danger. If we did not face the fact of the imaginable, of the vision, which is our nature, of the stories in us which in this age are trying to come to the surface, be known, be heard, be found, be written, and perhaps be interpreted, we were in trouble. Late in life, he said, the world hangs by a thread, and that thread is the psyche, the soul, and its imaginal words, languages, forms, myths. He was looking at what it was to be human. Dr. Sonu Shamdasani introduced the Red Book at the Library of Congress in 2010. They had a big museum show there and a conference. And Sonu gave an amazing talk. And again, it's one of those things you can find on YouTube if you go looking. And Sonu talked about Jung's approach to Blake and Swedenborg, visionaries, and compared Jung's approach to these individuals, what he'd said about them. And then he concluded with these words. This is what Dr. Shamdasani said. Quote, if, as Jung claimed, Dante and Blake clothed visionary experience in mythological forms, could we not pose the question, did Jung in turn attempt to clothe visionary experience in conceptual, psychological forms? If so, the power and significance of his work does not reside in his concepts, which are familiar to us, but in the visionary experience which was at the back of them. End quote. Dr. Shamdasani is the Philbin Professor of Jung History at the University College London. He's in his mid-50s now. He is certainly the most knowledgeable historian of Jung I know. He spent more than half his life involved in this stuff. He spent now 20 years working on the Red Book, Jung's diaries from this period, his collected writings thereafter. What was the man's conclusion? The power and significance of his work does not reside in his concepts, which are familiar to us, but in the visionary experience, which was at the back of them. Professor John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. One of the most common questions I asked by fans of Tolkien, and by people involved in Tolkien studies, is, did Tolkien believe in elves? And I've been asked that question a few times. People know of my interests. And I have an answer. No. Tolkien did not believe in elves. Tolkien knew elves. He had met many. He knew their names. He knew their stories. He knew their sorrows. He knew their elven art. And the question that usually follows up to that is, what you're saying then is, Tolkien was crazy? And you see, that's the box. Where do you put this experience? that's why I think, when you have paradigmatic cases, you need more than one. Otherwise, it's what I call the chop suey problem. It's the sui generis. It's just one of a kind. Well, what kind is it? It's that one kind. You need to bring things into context, into that transdisciplinary dialogue. You need to look at these human experiences side by side before you can start contextualizing. My gosh, it's not just the one of a kind, it is the human kind. Does that make sense? And that's why I found it so critically important to look at these two figures and their approaches together. And believe me, I'm not trying to force this stuff together. That doesn't work. You can't do that as a scholar validly. I mean, people do it, but I really tried to see, does it fit, and I conclude it does. Tolkien had some interesting experiences as a young man, too. Some people are more visual, as Tolkien wrote in later life with their visionary experience. Some are more auditory. Jung said exactly the same thing in a long essay. And early in life, Tolkien really had an amazing sense of language. When he discovered as a young teenager the language Anglo-Saxon, he felt he actually already knew it. It came to him just quite naturally. In those same early years, maybe later teenage years, he started experiencing what he called his ghost words. Ghost, well, Tolkien was interested in words. He was a philologist by profession. The word goes all the way back into Indo-European roots. It's in Sanskrit as well. Ghost, it means a spirit, a soul, a spirit word, a ghost, soul word. And these words would come to him. They'd come to him fully formed, and they'd come to him with meaning. He explained later on that most frequently they came as nouns, but there were adjectives, fewer verbs that would come. Earrandil, Ainur, Valar, Iluvitar Melko, Varda, Silmaril, Elbareth Gilthoniel, Luthien, Tenuviel. Words. And he imagined this was in some unknowable manner an echo of his own original language. He kept a notebook with him in later years. When these words would come obtruding into consciousness, he'd write them down, he'd write down the meanings, and then as a philologist, he'd try to figure them out. Figure out what other words are related to them, how they evolved. And the words evolved into complex languages. And then Tolkien became convinced that language was related to a mythology. That languages were formed in mythologies. Meanings were involved and related to mythologies. The languages brought him stories. I think it was in 1913 or 1914. He was walking on the Cornish coast, stormy sea coast of England, and a name came to him. Earrandil. It seemed significant in immense ways. He went home and he wrote a poem about it. A fragment. It was a mythic image of Earrandil, the one who had sailed across the Western Sea into the sky. And he knew it was part of something. He sent the poem to a friend, one of his dear school friends, and the friend wrote him back a letter. He says, well, that's really very interesting. But what's it about? And Tolkien's response was, I don't know. I'll have to find out. I'll have to find out. Not, I will have to create something. Gosh, I'll have to make up the rest of that story, won't I? I'll have to find out. Tolkien spent the next 40 years of his life finding out. This figure remains a key in his mythology for decades. Many things opened up in this time, and and Becca's talk covered some of this stuff very well. And also, I have about 5 hours of Tolkien lectures online, which are illustrated. I have some of the illustrations of things he was doing during this period. If you're interested in this, go looking there. You can find more. By 1915, after he had graduated from Oxford, he was deeply in love, he married, and he got sent to war. In July 1st, Lieutenant Tolkien was at the Somme, at the beginning of the Battle of the Somme, the most horrendous sacrifice of the First World War. In the first day of the battle, 20,000 British soldiers died. Over the next 4 months of the battle, there were over 1 million casualties, over 250,000 dead, although the exact number is not really known. And they were dead and lying, wounded, over 500 or 600 meters of French mud. Tolkien saw it all. He was a signal officer. He was at the fronts trying to communicate the carnage at the front to the commanding officers at the back. He witnessed it. 2 of his 3 best friends died at the Somme. Tolkien, at the end of October, really as the battle was winding down, almost over, became ill. He started developing high fevers. He was diagnosed as having trench fever, which was an unknown disease, marked by high fevers and aching joints. It was thought to be, now we think it was probably conveyed by something carried by the lice in the trenches, of which all the men were infested. And he was sent home to England, to hospital. At that moment, the Elven mythologies really opened up. He began writing. He had a little school notebook, and in December, while he was in hospital, he started writing the first of his Elven stories. They're called the Lost Tales. They're not complete stories. They're not literary works. They're condensations of things that were working on him. But some of those tales stuck with him. They were foundational to everything he did thereafter. One was the story of Beren and Luthien Tuliel, a man who fell in love with an elven princess. And to win her hand, had to win back a stolen gem of light. A gem stolen by a force of evil in this world. You know, I'll just say this in passing. People have said, well, maybe Tolkien had PTSD. I've seen people with PTSD from World War II onward, through all those conflicts. And believe me, I'm seeing a great deal of it right now. This wasn't PTSD. I know what that is. I see that. This may have been a therapeutic move for Tolkien, but it was not a manifestation of a disorder. Maybe it was his therapeutic move. Then something extraordinary happened. In 1919, he wrote a cosmogonic myth. What's a cosmogonic myth? It's like a story of the coming to consciousness, the coming to being, the coming to reality of a world of us. You don't run into these very often. I should add, in 1916, Jung did exactly the same thing. He also wrote an amazing cosmogonic myth. These are the sources of religions, the key texts of religious movements. And he called it the Einerlindele, the music of the gods. Speaking of the stuff that was happening much later, he wrote in letters, he said of these things, they arose in my mind as given things. As they came separately too, so the links grew, and absorbing, though continually interrupted, labor. Yet always I had the sense of recording what was already there, somewhere, not of inventing. Not of inventing. And what did you think he was doing in those early years? He explained years later what he was doing. I had a mind to make a body of more or less connected legend, running from the large and cosmogonic to the level of the romantic fairy tale, which I would dedicate simply to England, to my country. In another letter, this is 1950, in another letter, 1956, he said that the venture he had undertaken was precisely to restore to England an epic tradition and present them with a mythology of their own. He was trying to create a mythology. Jung, remember mythology? Finding a mythology? Living, needing a mythology? He felt England needed a mythology. But what's a mythology? Isn't that a given thing? Received from past, from history, from peoples, from ancient times, from ancient superstitions. Aren't myths sort of canonical? Tolkien was trying to fracture canon. Fracture the sense of a canon of myth. A new myth for a new time, for his people. This is what that young man back from the war, writing those myths, moving on for the next 20 years writing, was thinking. He worked into the night on these things. I mean, Tolkien was a busy man. He had a full professorial schedule. He taught a full set of lectures. He was a don at the university. He had all these damn department meetings and things to go to, and all the administrative affairs, which some of you probably take doing with great joy, but Tolkien didn't. He was doing this stuff. And then he would sit at night, late into the night, doing this his mythological work. And he didn't know what he was doing. What was this hermeneutic? He tried writing this stuff in the form of fairy stories. Simple. He tried doing it in poetry, couplets, in alliterative verse. He wrote some of this stuff in Anglo-Saxon. He did some of it in Elven. What was the hermeneutic? What was the appropriate voice for conveying what he had been doing? And he had no intention, no thought that he could get it published. Then, of course, in 1937, a children's story, a story he told his children, ends up in the hands of a publisher, gets published in The Hobbit, is a hit in England. First printing, 3,000 copies is selling. And all of a sudden, Tolkien is known for that. It was embarrassing, in a way. He says that people at Oxford used to rouse him, Professor, how's your Hobbit doing? The professor of Anglo-Saxon literature, known for his Hobbit story. Well, and it was at this point, Tolkien had worked on this, what I call that secondary hermeneutic, sort of trying to describe what it is you have been doing. He had done this with his lecture on Beowulf at the British Academy in 1936, and he received an invitation to St. Andrews to give a lecture, the Andrew Lang lecture. And he determined he was going to talk about what he'd been doing. He called the lecture on fairy stories. But you know what? He wasn't interested in talking about fairy stories. He started out his entire lecture by saying, what people call fairy stories, they aren't fairy stories. That's not what I'm talking about. He wanted to talk about fairy, the experience of the imaginal. And so in the first part of his lecture, he just moves away from all that stuff. We don't have the text of the original lecture. But over the next 3 years, he worked on a draft manuscript of a final published edition. And he published it. And he cut out the best parts. There were things he said as he was authoring this material that was really self-revelatory. But when he finally got to the final text, he cut this stuff out. It was unknown for years and years and years. Finally, it was published just a few years ago of his draft manuscripts. Verlin Flieger and I think Anderson went through and they edited all this stuff out. And the stuff he said is amazing. The stuff he was afraid to say in public. And it's a key text. There's another key text that I can't get to tonight, but this is a key text. He started the draft introduction, the one he didn't use. And he said, "The land of Faerie is wide and deep and high. In that land a man may perhaps count himself fortunate to have wandered. But its very mystery and wealth make dumb the traveler who would report. The fairy gold too often turns to withered leaves when it is brought away. All that I can ask is that you will receive my withered leaves, as a token at least that my hand once held a little fairy gold." That my hand once held a little fairy gold. Well, he cut that out. But I love that line because you know what Jung said about his early experiences? Let me just read you. This is what Jung wrote in his end of his life about his early experiences. He said, "I felt that at some time or the other I had passed through the Valley of Diamonds, but I could convince no one that the specimens I brought back were more than pieces of gravel." So he asked, what is fairy? What is fairy? And once again, he's not talking about fairy stories. Fairy. would be equivalent to what Jung would call the collective unconscious. The realm, archetypal realm, imaginative realm. So he says, what is fairy? It reposes in a view that the normal world, tangible, visible, audible, is only an appearance. Behind it is a reservoir of power, which is manifest in these forms. If we can drive a well down to this reservoir, we shall tap a power that can not only change the visible forms of things already existent, but sprout up with a boundless wealth forms of things never before known, potential but unrealized. Later in the notes, he puts in this other thing. He starts talking about this Fairy drama. He said the difficult task was to enter this fairy realm and see it. And see it, and he quotes, in action and being as we see our objective world, with the mind free from the limited body. A Fairy drama. To see it as we see our objective world. You see that immediacy of vision. To enter a Fairy drama, free mind. Then he says something else, and this is exactly like Jung. He says, an essential power of fairy, is thus the power of making immediately effective, by will, the visions of fantasy. Visions of fantasy. This is exactly what Jung was trying to do in 1913 and 1914 winter. Make effective, by will, visions. Tolkien goes on further in an attempt to describe what it was like to be in a Fairy drama. And he goes on, he says, Fairy drama. Those plays which, according to abundant records, the elves have often presented to men, can produce a fantasy, with a realism and immediacy beyond the compass of any human mechanism. As a result, their usual effect upon a man is to go beyond belief. If you are present at a Fairy drama, you yourself are, or think you are, bodily inside its world. The experience may be very similar to dreaming, but in Fairy drama, you are in a dream that some other mind is weaving. And the knowledge of that alarming fact may slip from your grasp. I believe Tolkien was talking about something he had experienced. You think you are there. And this is, of course, again, this is a description of what Jung was talking about in his own annals of experience. Did Tolkien know elves? The question. What did he mean by Fairy drama? This is the stuff that has been tossed around in Tolkien studies for the last few decades. And very little understood, as Becca quite correctly said in her introduction. But in the last issue of Tolkien Studies, it's an annual, the 2014 edition came out last fall, Verlin Flieger, perhaps one of the best known and perhaps one of the best Tolkien scholars. She's been a professor at the University of Maryland. She's now, I believe, in her 80s. I think she's retired from her professorship. She is the one who edited the notes, the draft material on fairy stories that I was just reading from. She's been all through the archives at the Bodleian at Oxford. An amazing scholar, and a cautious scholar. But from the very beginning of her books, it was clear that she saw something about Tolkien that others weren't. And she finally did it. She finally said it. She wrote a paper called, What Did He Really Mean? And in that paper, which if you're interested in Tolkien studies, you should look at, what she said is he meant what he said. He said lots of things, but when he said this stuff about elves, about visions, he meant it. it had happened. Oh, she's a cautious scholar, she's a little soft on the edges of some of those affirmations. But then she gives this final quote. It's well known to most Tolkien scholars. It was written by a woman who knew him well, who worked on translations from Middle English with him. A longtime partner. And she gives this quote, written by this friend of Tolkien's. I said to him once, "You broke the veil, didn't you? And passed through." Which in fact he did, and which he readily admitted. No wonder, therefore, that he could recapture the language of the fairies. You broke the veil and passed through, which he readily admitted. Passed through. What does that mean? Consider his comment. The power of making effective by will the vision of fantasy. Perhaps that is what he meant. And Professor Tolkien worked on his mythology for 40 years. It grew from foundation in layers through ages to a third age. This book that has sold 250 million copies, been made into movies, seen by untold hundreds of millions of people, is about the end of an age. A task, a conflict. My intuition is that these imaginal stories have meaning. It's been suggested to me, and I've thought it myself, that if we do indeed survive for 500 years and look back at this age, asking from that perspective far away what our myths were, what were the foundational myths, what were the important stories we told, what were our religious stories, I thought that the Red Book of Jung and Tolkien may be on the list of foundational mythologies of a new human consciousness. Maybe that's a prophecy, and maybe not. It is my intuition. At the doorway of Shelob's lair in The Lord of the Rings, Sam realized that the story he was in was a very old story. It went all the way back to Beren and Luthien, the story that Tolkien first heard after the Great War. And he looked at Frodo and he said, "Don't the great tales never end?" "No, they never end as tales," said Frodo. "But the people in them come and go when their parts ended."